I never imagined that a single dinner could turn my entire world upside down. 3 days ago, at what was supposed to be our engagement dinner, my life changed forever. Sitting across from me, Ethan, my fiance, the man I thought I knew completely, looked me in the eye and said, "This is non-negotiable. Mason has been in my life longer than you have. He stays, or we end this here." My chest tightened, my throat went dry. I am Layla, 33, a civil engineer in Austin, practical, organized, and careful with every decision. But nothing could have prepared me for this. Around us, our families filled the private dining room at Jeffrey's downtown, 12 people in total, enjoying what they thought would be a celebratory evening. Instead, silence fell like a weight. Ethan slid a glossy, professionally bound packet across the table. Its color-coded tabs and corporate polish screamed strategy, not love. The title read, Family of Choice Agreement. My first instinct was to laugh. It had to be a joke, but Ethan's expression was deadly serious. Mason, his ex-boyfriend and now a close family friend, was apparently expected to remain a permanent part of our lives. I flipped through those pages, my mind struggling to comprehend. There were clauses detailing Mason's role as a creative advisor for our wedding, stipulations for his inclusion in holidays, birthdays, and all major life events, even decisions about hypothetical future children. The document read like a merger, not a marriage. My parents froze, uncertain. Ethan's mother beamed with pride, while his father nodded as if all of this made perfect sense. I folded the packet, placed it beside my plate, and said quietly, "Understood." Then I stood up, thanked everyone for dinner, and walked out. No yelling, no argument, no dramatic scene, just a calm exit from a situation that felt like a trap. The drive home felt endless. 20 minutes of replaying his words, questioning myself, had I misunderstood something? No. He had presented a contract demanding that a man from his past be permanently integrated into our marriage. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I called my lawyer. Love wasn't the issue anymore. Respect and boundaries were. And one thing was certain, my life, as I had imagined it, was over. I always thought I knew what love looked like. Steady, predictable, built on trust. At 33, I had carved a life for myself. A career as a civil engineer, designing urban housing projects in Austin, a tight circle of friends, and a family that valued honesty and hard work above all. I was practical, cautious, and careful with my heart. Yet when I met Ethan, everything I believed about myself shifted. We met 5 years ago at a charity gala downtown. I was there with colleagues. He was volunteering for a local environmental nonprofit. I remember the way he smiled, calm, confident, like he genuinely wanted to understand you before speaking. It wasn't instant fireworks, but something slower, deeper. Over the next months, dinners turned into weekend hikes, phone calls into late-night conversations that made me forget how exhausted I was from work. Ethan was different from anyone I had dated. He had 2 teenage kids from a previous marriage, and yet he navigated fatherhood with such care that I couldn't help but admire him. I loved that about him. He was devoted, patient, a protector. I tried to be supportive, never overstepping, letting him guide the relationship at his pace. And for the most part, it worked. We became a team, a unit, entwined in the everyday rhythm of life. His parents, Greg and Elaine, were always present, hovering in subtle ways. Greg, a retired attorney, spoke carefully and measuredly, his approval earned through quiet deference. Elaine, a marriage therapist with a popular blog about evolved relationships, had opinions about every decision, from how Ethan and I spent holidays to the color of the napkins at his kids' birthdays. They were polished, intense, and progressive to a fault, but I assumed that was just how they showed love. At first, it was charming. Ethan would joke about their modern parenting philosophy, and I would laugh along. But over time, the edges of control began to show. Comments about how boundaries in blended families must be sacred, or how past relationships can influence future happiness, began to make me question myself. I brushed off the unease, convincing myself that they were just being protective and that my love for Ethan would smooth any friction. We had our moments of pure joy, too. I still remember the first time I met his kids properly, sitting in the living room, building a Lego set with his son, helping his daughter pick out a science fair project. We laughed at silly jokes, argued over board game rules, and for a brief period, everything felt perfect. But even then, subtle signs hinted that I was never the only consideration in his life. Mason, his close friend and former partner in creative projects, was always present, always consulted. I noticed the glances Ethan and Mason exchanged, small moments I dismissed as professional camaraderie. By the time Ethan proposed, I was sure of my feelings. The ring sparkled, the restaurant smelled faintly of roses and garlic, and both our families toasted to the future. I thought marriage meant trust, respect, and choosing each other above all else. I never imagined that choosing each other could come with a list of conditions, rules, and a permanent ex-boyfriend. I had only seen love as a bond between two people, not a document to be negotiated, an investment to be managed. Looking back, there were red flags, subtle yet persistent. His reluctance to discuss the wedding plans in private, frequent texts from Mason with cryptic tones, and Elaine's persistent advice about modern family branding. But I trusted Ethan. I loved him. And love, I thought, was enough to overcome anything, even the quiet unease that sometimes pricked at the edges of my happiness. And yet, that trust shattered in one dinner, in front of both our families, when love collided with strategy, and I realized I had been preparing to marry a life that wasn't entirely mine. In the months leading up to our engagement, small things began to unsettle me. At first, they were easy to dismiss, passing comments, little inconveniences, but slowly, a pattern emerged that I couldn't ignore. It started with Mason. He was Ethan's longtime friend, someone who had been in his life longer than I had. At first, I was grateful for the stability he provided, the way he understood Ethan's quirks and supported him in his projects. But the more I observed, the more I noticed Mason's subtle influence. He wasn't just a friend, he was a fixture, consulted on everything from interior design to Ethan's career decisions. His opinions carried weight, almost as if he were a co-architect of our lives rather than a guest in them. Then there were Ethan's parents, Greg and Elaine. Greg maintained a composed exterior, but Elaine was relentless. Every conversation with her carried a subtle agenda. Have you thought about how this affects the children? Or, in modern families, it's important to honor past relationships equally. She spoke as if she were shaping a case study, not preparing to celebrate a marriage. I tried to laugh it off, but there was an unease in her gaze, a quiet judgment that made me second-guess myself. The tension came to a head during one evening, when we all met for dinner at Ethan's apartment. His parents were discussing wedding plans, colors, themes, even how Mason would be involved in the ceremony's creative direction. I tried to interject politely, suggesting alternatives or expressing my preferences, but every time I did, Mason or Elaine would counter with a reasoned argument. "It's just tradition, Layla," Mason said, smiling at Ethan in a way that made my chest tighten. "We want to make this special for the family, not just the couple. Special for the family, not for us." I remember staring at Ethan across the table, searching for some sign that he saw my discomfort, some acknowledgement that our priorities should matter first. He smiled, nodded, and said, "We can consider that, love," but the hesitation in his voice betrayed his true allegiance. He wasn't dismissive, not exactly, but he wasn't defending me either. It wasn't just dinners or conversations. Mason's presence seeped into daily life. Weekend hikes I thought would be just for us were punctuated by his calls, texts, and subtle guidance. His creative advice on wedding visuals, the family brand, the children's education, it was all framed as helping, but the effect was clear. My voice was optional, my consent assumed. I remember walking home one night after a particularly long family discussion about the wedding vision. I felt hollow, a strange mix of frustration and fear. I asked myself quietly, am I imagining this? Am I overreacting? But deep down, the answer was already there. The signs were everywhere, from the way Mason's opinions carried more weight than mine, to the way Ethan deferred to his mother for decisions I thought were ours. Even my friends began noticing subtle changes in my demeanor. They would ask why I seemed quieter on calls, why I hesitated when discussing wedding plans. I didn't have an answer, or perhaps I didn't want to admit the truth, that the man I loved was slowly being pulled into a world where I had no authority, no control, and no guarantee of respect. I held on to hope that this would change once we got engaged, that formalizing our commitment would create a clear boundary. I pictured Ethan choosing me first, me above all others in his life. But the hints of manipulation, the pressure from his parents, and Mason's constant presence had already planted a seed. I just didn't know how quickly it would bloom, or how devastating the harvest would be. And then came the evening at Jeffrey's downtown, the night that would uproot everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the life I believed I was building. The seed had grown silently, but now it was ready to burst into full-blown conflict. The night of our engagement dinner should have been a celebration. The restaurant was dimly lit, polished, and filled with the faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses. I had spent hours preparing, choosing my dress carefully, rehearsing polite greetings for both families, and telling myself that this would be a joyful evening. I never expected it would become the moment my world fractured. We were seated at a long table in the private dining room. Both our families sat around us, all 12 of them, animated and polite. The air smelled faintly of roasted garlic and caramelized desserts. Everything looked perfect on the surface. My parents were relaxed, enjoying conversation with Greg and Elaine, while Ethan's parents were poised, polished, professional, just as I had come to expect. Then Sloane, Ethan, in this rewrite, slid something across the table toward me. A glossy, professionally bound packet with color-coded tabs and legal-looking fonts. My pulse quickened immediately. My fingers hesitated as I touched the edge. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though my chest tightened. Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Family of choice agreement," he said, casually, almost rehearsed. "Just some things I thought we should formalize before the wedding." I blinked. My mind went blank for a split second. "Formalize?" I echoed, my voice a whisper. "Yes," Ethan replied. "It's about making sure the people important in our lives remain part of them." His words were calm, but I noticed the slight nod he gave Mason, sitting a little to the side, quietly observing. Mason's expression was unreadable, but there was a subtle smugness in his eyes. I opened the packet slowly, almost in disbelief. Color-coded sections, detailed clauses, legal terminology, and then my heart sank. There it was, in black and white. Mason, Ethan's ex-friend, was to remain a permanent fixture in our marriage, involved in holidays, birthdays, and even future children's lives. He was listed as a creative advisor for our wedding brand campaign, a role I hadn't even known existed. I felt my hands tremble slightly, heat rising to my face. My mind raced. This isn't about love. This is about control. Strategy. I looked at my parents. Their faces mirrored my shock. My father, usually calm, looked like he had seen a ghost. My mother's lips parted slightly in disbelief. Across the table, Ethan's mother smiled proudly, as if presenting a well-earned achievement. Greg nodded slowly, approvingly. I tried to steady my breathing, to find words. "Ethan, why is Mason included in all of this? I thought this was our wedding, our family," I said, voice shaking despite my attempt at composure. Ethan's eyes met mine, calm but firm. "Layla, Mason has been part of my life longer than you have. He stays, or we end this here." The words hit me like a hammer. My stomach lurched. I felt dizzy, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands gripped the table as if it could anchor me to reality. I could see it then, the full tableau of manipulation. Mason, quietly seated, his expression almost reverent. Ethan's parents, nodding and smiling, reinforcing the ultimatum. My parents, stunned, unsure how to intervene, and Ethan, the man I thought I knew, placing me in a position I could not accept. I realized in that moment that this was never about compromise. It was never about love. It was about submission, my acceptance of conditions I could never agree to. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, and I felt a surge of clarity. I folded the packet neatly, placed it beside my plate, and said, "Understood." No pleading, no anger, no dramatics. Just calm, deliberate acknowledgement. Then I stood up, thanked everyone for dinner, and walked out. Each step toward the exit was heavy, but purposeful. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't break down in front of either family. I just left. The moment I stepped outside into the cool night air, a sense of both dread and relief washed over me. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down, yet also the clarity of having chosen myself. My life as I knew it, my vision of love, marriage, and family, was over. And in that instant, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not with Ethan, not with his family, and certainly not with myself. This dinner wasn't just a conflict, it was a turning point. The line had been drawn, and I had just crossed it. The drive home from Jeffrey's downtown was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my chest heavy with disbelief. Every detail of that dinner replayed in my mind. The glossy packet, Ethan's ultimatum, Mason's smug expression, and his parents' approving nods. It all felt surreal, like I had been thrust into someone else's reality while my own had dissolved. At home, I leaned against the kitchen counter, my hands trembling. My heart raced, my stomach churned, and for the first time in years, I felt completely unmoored. I kept asking myself over and over, did I misread him? Did I misunderstand something? Was this somehow my fault? But deep down, the answer was clear. I had not misread him. This was deliberate. I called Tessa, my closest friend and a corporate lawyer. Her voice on the other end was calm, but immediately alert. "Tell me everything, start from the top," she said. I recounted every moment, every word, every gesture. As I spoke, the tension in my body grew tighter, but so did a sense of resolve. Tessa listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions. Did he explain why Mason had to stay? Any mention of compromise? I shook my head. No, it was absolute. Mason stays, or we're done. After I hung up, I sat on the floor of my apartment, the packet still on the counter. I felt a torrent of emotions: shock, grief, anger, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. How could someone I loved, someone I trusted so completely, place me in a position where my consent was optional? The notion that my feelings could be negotiated like a business deal made my chest tighten with indignation. I thought about Ethan's words over and over. Mason has been in my life longer than you have. Those words, casual yet cutting, replayed in my mind like a mantra I couldn't escape. My vision of a marriage built on love, mutual respect, and shared dreams felt shattered. In that moment, I realized something crucial. Love without respect is nothing more than convenience. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, my mind racing through possible ways to confront him. I thought about storming back into his life, demanding an explanation, forcing a confrontation. But I knew myself. Exploding in anger would accomplish nothing. I needed clarity, evidence, and a plan. Calm, not chaos, would be my ally. The next morning, I took the first practical steps. I revoked Ethan's access to my joint accounts, changed passwords on shared utilities, and sent a concise email to my parents. I am done pretending he respects me. There was no melodrama, no begging for advice, just clarity and action. My parents, though shocked, immediately understood. My father's voice was firm yet kind. "Layla, you did the right thing. Don't let anyone undermine your worth." But I also had to face reality emotionally. I was grieving, not for the relationship, but for the version of myself who had believed in this future. I felt anger at Ethan, disappointment in the way his family had orchestrated this dinner, and a deep sense of isolation. Yet beneath it all, there was a seed of empowerment. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the stirrings of agency. I realized I could choose myself, set boundaries, and refuse to be complicit in a plan that violated my values. Later that day, I drafted a message to Ethan. Not accusatory, not pleading, just a measured statement. I need space to process this. We need to talk when we can communicate respectfully, without ultimatums or contracts. Right now, I am not willing to accept this arrangement. I didn't know how he would respond. I didn't care. For the first time, my priorities were my own, not his parents, not Mason's. In the quiet moments, when I let myself breathe, I reflected on what this meant for me. I was strong, resilient, and capable of navigating betrayal without losing myself. I knew the confrontation with Ethan was inevitable, but I also understood that it would have to occur on my terms, with preparation, with evidence, and with a clear sense of self-worth. That night, I allowed myself one private act of defiance. I placed the packet in a drawer and closed it, symbolically shutting away the illusion of control they had tried to impose. And as I lay down to sleep, I whispered to myself, I am not negotiating my dignity. I am not negotiating my life. This is mine to reclaim. The reaction was over, but the battle was only beginning. And I knew that in order to protect myself, I would have to face Ethan and his world with courage, clarity, and unshakable resolve. The days after the engagement dinner were surreal. Texts from Ethan shifted from the casual warmth I had known to a relentless barrage of pressure. Layla, you embarrassed everyone. Can we talk? And you're being controlling and regressive. I read each one slowly, feeling the sting of betrayal deepen, yet underneath it all, a strange clarity emerged. I was no longer reacting blindly. I was preparing. Ethan's parents escalated their interference next. Elaine's blog posts appeared like clockwork, subtle barbs veiled in intellectual discourse. When partners fear your freedom, the relationship suffers, one article read. My friends began sending me screenshots, their messages filled with incredulity. I didn't reply. How could I respond to a veiled attack that masqueraded as guidance? Greg, usually the voice of measured authority, began inserting himself directly into our communications. Emails arrived in my inbox, requests for clarification on family agreements, veiled suggestions about compromise, and thinly disguised arguments for the legitimacy of Mason's continued presence in Ethan's life. It wasn't just interference, it was a campaign. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, the glow of my laptop illuminating my tired eyes, Tessa beside me, laptop open, documents strewn across the counter. Layla, every text, every email, every financial transaction, they're building a paper trail, she said. I nodded, my hands pressed to my temples. It was overwhelming, but I realized then that the key to surviving this was methodical preparation. It wasn't just the parents. Friends and acquaintances began weighing in, often siding with Ethan's family. Casual comments turned into subtle judgments. Maybe you overreacted, or Ethan is just trying to include everyone. I felt the walls closing in, the social pressure intensifying, and yet my resolve hardened. I began documenting everything: screenshots, invoices, blog posts, and messages. Each piece of evidence was a reminder that I was not imagining this. Financial manipulations surfaced too. Tessa discovered several charges that violated our agreement about wedding expenses, spa weekends, designer dress rentals, and even a wedding mood board studio session organized by Mason, billed directly to my credit card. The sheer audacity made my blood boil, but I didn't react impulsively. I disputed the charges with the bank, freezing the card pending investigation. That small act gave me a sense of agency, a way to push back against a system designed to sideline me. One afternoon, I confronted Ethan directly. We met at a quiet cafe, away from the prying eyes of his parents. My voice was calm but firm. Ethan, this isn't love anymore. This is strategy. You've aligned yourself with Mason and your parents against me. I need to know where you stand, truly stand, before we can discuss a future together. He hesitated, his eyes shifting. Layla, I just want what's best for everyone. I'm trying to honor relationships, not hurt you. I stared at him, seeing the conflict, but also the allegiance he had chosen. Ethan, you're not honoring me. You're negotiating me, and that's not a marriage. It's a merger. I cannot be part of this. The conversation ended without resolution, but it clarified the divide. I knew then that nothing short of a full acknowledgement of the manipulation would allow me to move forward. I also knew that the family dynamic would not relent. They were deeply invested in this modern family brand that treated me as negotiable. Over the next week, the pressure mounted. Mason reached out indirectly, his messages polite but invasive. I just want to help preserve what we've built together. Every word, every attempt at reassurance was another assertion of control. Elaine's blog continued to subtly criticize partners who fear evolving relationships, and Greg emailed me yet another draft of a proposed family agreement. I began to feel the emotional weight of being under siege. The combination of social pressure, financial manipulation, and psychological tactics could have broken me. But instead, it strengthened my clarity. I spent hours with Tessa strategizing, building a comprehensive record of every interaction, every breach of trust, every inappropriate charge. We prepared a presentation that could expose the manipulation if necessary, a tool of defense, not revenge. It wasn't easy. Late nights were punctuated by doubts. I questioned myself, am I overreacting? Am I being too rigid? But each time, the evidence reminded me that this was real, orchestrated, and intentional. I also found solace in small routines, long walks in the evening, calls with supportive friends, and the quiet comfort of my apartment, where I could think without intrusion. Then came the day I finally presented the evidence to Ethan's family in a neutral setting, a small community center downtown. Both families attended, along with Tessa as my advocate. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Ethan tried to mediate, but his own hesitations betrayed him. I set up the projector, and one by one, the facts were laid bare. Text messages showing premeditation, invoices proving unauthorized charges, blog posts aimed at discrediting me, and the so-called family agreements that imposed Mason's role in our marriage. Greg's composure fractured first. His voice rose, accusing me of defamation. Tessa leaned forward calmly. Defamation requires falsehood. Everything here is documented. The room went silent, all eyes on Elaine, whose tears and frantic explanations revealed the truth. This wasn't about love, it was about control, about a manufactured narrative to protect a business model masquerading as family. As I sat back, I realized that the escalation had achieved something unexpected: clarity. The family's interference, Mason's presence, and Ethan's reluctant complicity had all been laid bare. I could see the cracks forming, the power shift becoming inevitable. And though the battle was far from over, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. After the community center confrontation, the world outside my apartment felt unusually cold and heavy. The adrenaline from presenting the evidence faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I thought the exposure of the truth would bring relief, a sense of vindication, but instead it left me feeling profoundly alone. The room had been full of witnesses, but no one could truly understand the weight of betrayal I carried. I spent the next several nights awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city below. My thoughts were relentless. Every memory of Ethan, the way he smiled at me in those early months, the warmth in his eyes during quiet moments, the way he spoke of our future, was now tainted by the realization that all of it had been part of a carefully constructed narrative. Mason, the so-called creative advisor, Elaine's blog, Greg's calculated involvement. The depth of premeditation was staggering. A feeling of vertigo settled over me. I questioned my own judgment. How could I have been so blind? Did I ignore the signs? Did I misread his words, his affection? The self-doubt gnawed at me, pulling me into a spiral. I felt like a character in someone else's story, a pawn in a plan designed to exploit my trust and manipulate my love. I tried to distract myself. Work, friends, long walks, but even the mundane became suffocating. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened. Messages from Ethan were more sporadic now, tinged with desperation and defensiveness. Layla, you're tearing our families apart. Please, can we find a compromise? I wanted to respond, to plead, to explain that the compromise he envisioned required me to erase my dignity, but no words seemed sufficient. The isolation grew when I realized that even some mutual friends had been subtly influenced. Comments like, "Maybe you're overreacting, Layla. He's just trying to honor important relationships," echoed in my mind, a chorus of doubt that made me question my own instincts. The loneliness was palpable, a weight pressing down on my chest, making each breath feel laborious. At my lowest point, I sat by the window in the dead of night, the city lights flickering in the distance. Tears ran unchecked down my face. I felt betrayed not just by Ethan, but by the illusion of love itself, the idea that mutual respect and shared dreams could survive in the face of such manipulation. My heart ached for the life I had imagined, a life now irreversibly tainted. In those moments, I was haunted by a sense of helplessness. I pictured Ethan and Mason laughing quietly over emails I would never see, planning the next step in a future from which I had been systematically excluded. Elaine's blog post played in my mind like a persistent echo, framing me as unreasonable, controlling, and incapable of embracing modern love. I felt invisible, diminished, and utterly powerless. Yet, amid the despair, a tiny ember of defiance remained. I realized that while they could manipulate perceptions, control finances, and stage appearances, they could not dictate my inner resolve. I clenched my fists, feeling the ache in my chest slowly transform into a simmering determination. The betrayal was raw, yes, but it also illuminated the boundaries I would no longer allow anyone to cross. I called Tessa late that night, my voice shaky but urgent. I don't know how to get through this. I feel lost. Tessa's calm, unwavering voice cut through the fog. Layla, it's supposed to feel like that. You've just been hit with the reality of betrayal and manipulation. But remember, you have evidence, clarity, and a plan. You're not powerless. The darkest moment is always the precursor to the turning point. Her words sank in slowly. I realized that my despair was not a failure. It was a signal, an emotional signal, that something in my life needed to change fundamentally. The depth of my hurt revealed the strength of my love, my commitment, and my values. It showed me what I could no longer accept. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote a single line in my journal. I have been broken, but I am not defeated. This ends on my terms. The act of writing anchored me, giving me the first real sense of agency I had felt since the engagement dinner. For the first time, I understood that hitting rock bottom was not the end. It was preparation. The emotional devastation sharpened my perspective. Every slight, every manipulation, every betrayal became a piece of a larger puzzle, one I was now determined to solve with precision, courage, and unwavering self-respect. By dawn, the ache remained, but so did a sense of clarity. I could see the path forward, however daunting it might be. I was alone, yes, but I was not powerless. And in that solitude, I found the first true taste of freedom. The days following my emotional collapse were quiet, almost deceptively calm. I spent hours sifting through documents, invoices, and messages that Tessa had helped me organize. Each file was a piece of the puzzle, and now, for the first time, I could see the bigger picture clearly. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was concrete, intentional, and meticulously orchestrated. Then came the breakthrough. Rachel, Sloane's college roommate and stylist who had become my unlikely ally, sent me something that made my pulse quicken, a folder she had pulled from Mason's laptop titled The Modern Family Brand, Turning Love into Legacy. As I opened it, my breath caught. It was everything I had feared and more. This wasn't just a family issue, this was a business plan. Mason and Ethan's parents had designed a strategy to monetize our marriage, to market it as a progressive relationship model, complete with sponsorships, weekend retreats, social media campaigns, and even a proposed book deal. They had planned for me to be the traditional partner who would learn to accept and embrace their version of modern love, while Mason and Elaine curated the narrative for public consumption. I felt a surge of disbelief, anger, and, strangely, relief. Disbelief because of the audacity, anger because of the manipulation, and relief because finally, I had incontrovertible proof. I was not imagining this. It was real, and I now had the tools to reclaim control. Tessa and I spent hours dissecting the document. Each page revealed layers of manipulation, timelines of when Mason would be consulting on family events, projected revenue streams tied to social media engagement, and even contingency plans for my potential non-compliance. The level of premeditation was staggering. Layla, Tessa said, looking at me with a mix of awe and concern, this is premeditated. They've been planning this for months, probably before your engagement. You were never just his fiancé. You were their target demographic. They wanted to shape your compliance into a product. I felt a cold, resolute clarity wash over me. Every slight, every manipulation, every ultimatum at the engagement dinner was no accident. This was a plan to control me, to commodify my consent and my love. And now, for the first time, I had the leverage to fight back, not with anger or revenge, but with truth, evidence, and strategy. The turning point came in the quiet moments after. I realized that my power had always been there, dormant under layers of trust and love. It had been buried by disbelief and the emotional weight of betrayal. But the evidence, the documents, and Rachel's intervention had awakened it. I could no longer be passive, no longer allow myself to be manipulated under the guise of love. I drafted a plan with Tessa. It wasn't about public humiliation, though part of me wanted it. It was about dismantling the control they thought they had and reclaiming my life. We prepared a presentation that would expose the manipulation to Ethan's family with receipts, emails, and screenshots as proof. The goal wasn't vengeance. It was clarity, accountability, and justice. That evening, I sat in my apartment, the city lights casting shadows across the floor. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm determination. I knew the confrontation with Ethan and his family would be difficult, that it would challenge me emotionally and mentally. But I was no longer the frightened, overwhelmed fiancé who had left the engagement dinner in silence. I was prepared. I had evidence. I had clarity. I had agency. I picked up my phone and drafted a single message to Ethan. "We need to meet. I am prepared to discuss everything openly, with evidence and transparency. The time for ultimatums is over. I am no longer negotiating my dignity." Hitting send felt liberating. For the first time, I recognized that I wasn't powerless. I was not just reacting to their manipulations. I was controlling the narrative, setting the terms, and taking responsibility for my own life. The fear that had gripped me for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a determined, almost serene sense of purpose. In the quiet of that night, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about the engagement dinner, the packet, the ultimatum, Mason's smug face, and I realized something profound. I didn't need to be angry to be strong. I didn't need to justify my feelings to anyone but myself. The betrayal had been brutal, but it had also revealed my own strength, resilience, and clarity. I went to bed that night with a renewed sense of self. I was no longer the fiancée trapped in a web of manipulation. I was Layla, the woman who would reclaim her life, set boundaries, and insist on respect, no matter the cost. And I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. The fallout began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but its effects rippled through every corner of Ethan's carefully constructed world. The day after I presented the evidence to his family and their allies, the tension was palpable. Messages and calls from mutual friends slowed, some even withdrew quietly, unwilling to take sides. The social web that had once pressured me into doubt began to unravel, not because I had sought revenge, but because the truth had a way of exposing itself. Ethan's parents were the first to show cracks. Greg, the composed, authoritative figure who had always exuded calm professionalism, was visibly shaken when confronted with the receipts, emails, and invoices. The illusion of control he had maintained for so long began to crumble. I watched as he attempted to rationalize the unthinkable, only to be countered at every turn by documented proof. Tessa's quiet but firm presence amplified the reality. Their narrative had collapsed under its own weight. Elaine, Ethan's mother, was even more visibly affected. Her carefully cultivated image of the evolved parent and modern love advocate began to falter. Blog comments, previously supportive, now flooded with skepticism and criticism. Her credibility took hits, not because of malicious intent on my part, but because the world could see the dissonance between her words and actions. The parenting philosophy she had championed was suddenly under scrutiny for prioritizing business schemes over the well-being of the people involved, namely, me. Mason, the supposed creative advisor and manipulator behind the family branding, also faced immediate repercussions. Two of his major clients discovered the leaked pitch deck and questioned his professional ethics. The photo shoots and brand campaigns that had been touted as collaborative projects were suddenly under legal and public scrutiny. Mason's carefully constructed professional image began to deteriorate almost overnight. Meanwhile, I experienced a profound sense of clarity and calm. I no longer needed to respond to the endless messages from Sloan, Elaine, or even Ethan. The ultimatums, the manipulations, the attempts to control my behavior, none of it held power over me anymore. I could step back and observe, knowing that the evidence spoke louder than any argument they could make. The most striking moment came when I finally received a mediated settlement proposal. Every clause was meticulously negotiated, reflecting the collapse of their initial control. My credit card disputes were dropped for minor charges, but the financial liability for all wedding contracts reverted entirely to Ethan's parents. The prenup addendums and family branding agreements were nullified, and non-disparagement clauses ensured that neither Mason nor Ethan's parents could manipulate the narrative in the future. Even Ethan signed a no-contact agreement, acknowledging that his previous allegiance to Mason and his family's plan had caused irreparable harm. Throughout the process, I maintained composure. I didn't gloat. I didn't lash out. I simply observed, noting the stark contrast between the orchestrated chaos of the past months and the calm resolution I had achieved. The ripple effects were undeniable. Ethan's family, once confident in their control, was forced into accountability. Mason's professional credibility suffered, and I emerged unscathed, protected by documentation, law, and clarity of mind. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the fallout was the social validation I received, not in applause, but in recognition of integrity. My HR department quietly commended me for handling the personal crisis professionally. Friends expressed admiration, not for the drama itself, but for the strength, strategy, and calm I had maintained throughout. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen, not as a victim, but as a woman who had refused to be manipulated. In the quiet aftermath, I also allowed myself moments of reflection. I thought about the engagement dinner, the glossy packet, the ultimatum, the expectation that I would acquiesce. Those moments, once sources of humiliation and anger, had become catalysts for empowerment. I had turned deception into clarity, pressure into preparation, and betrayal into resilience. By the time the dust settled, the consequences for Ethan, his parents, and Mason had been swift but measured. Their credibility, influence, and social sway had diminished, not through public spectacle, but through the quiet and undeniable force of truth. And I, standing on the other side, was free to rebuild my life, free to reclaim my energy, and free to choose relationships and partnerships that honored mutual respect and boundaries. In the end, the fallout was not about punishment. It was about restoration. Restoration of my agency, my dignity, and my ability to navigate life on my own terms. While Ethan and his family faced the repercussions of their choices, I experienced the profound calm that comes from knowing that integrity, preparation, and clarity can dismantle even the most calculated manipulations. Life after the fallout felt quieter, slower, and infinitely more peaceful. The storm of ultimatums, manipulations, and staged confrontations had passed, leaving me with a space I could finally fill with clarity, purpose, and intentional choices. I had regained control over my own narrative, and in that calm, I began to truly notice the beauty of ordinary life again. I threw myself into my work, finishing the affordable housing project I had been leading for months. The East Side infill development won an Urban Innovation Grant, a recognition that reminded me of the tangible impact one could create when focus and integrity were aligned. My small house, with its reclaimed wood siding and native oak trees, became a sanctuary, a place to reflect, recharge, and plan the next chapters of my life without interference or manipulation. One afternoon, at a community volunteer build, I met Harper, an environmental architect from Dallas. There was no cinematic spark, no over-the-top chemistry, just a quiet understanding. We discussed sustainable design, stormwater management, and the intricacies of green architecture over coffee. It was refreshing to engage with someone without hidden agendas, someone who valued collaboration over control. In that simplicity, I realized how much I had yearned for authenticity in all areas of my life. I also reflected on what I had learned from the ordeal with Ethan, his family, Merle, and Mason. The engagement dinner that had once seemed like the ultimate humiliation now stood as a turning point in my life. I had discovered that ultimatums disguised as love were never love at all. I had seen how carefully constructed manipulation could masquerade as generosity, and I had learned the importance of trusting my instincts, setting boundaries, and refusing to compromise my dignity for the comfort of others. The legal resolutions, though complex, had sealed the chapter neatly. Non-disparagement agreements, financial accountability, and professional protections ensured that the manipulative parties could no longer interfere in my life. Yet the most valuable outcome wasn't legal, it was personal. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more attuned to my own values. As I watched children laugh on the newly completed playground, sunlight glinting off slides and swings, I felt a profound sense of peace. My past struggles no longer weighed me down. They had become the foundation for my growth. I understood, finally, that freedom and respect were non-negotiable, that love should never come at the expense of one's integrity, and that walking away from manipulation was a form of courage, not failure. I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that life had given me a second chance, not just at happiness, but at building something real, sustainable, and meaningful. The lesson was clear. Never negotiate with someone who doesn't respect your right to say no, and trust your instincts from the first warning. With that clarity, I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and stepped forward into a future that I would shape on my own terms, stronger, wiser, and free.